bunch of doctors on the side just throw their assistants money.
Interesting.
And everybody becomes very loyal, right? So then he creates this bubble around.
Yeah,
what I want to know about.
Yeah, dive into this.
So you're saying, though, that there's a high likelihood that the reason why that employee that complained about him all the time, the reason why she stood there, which I always asked myself, why do you stay even though you hate this dentist, is because he's doing a little bit of money under the table.
Yes, of course.
Interesting. I mean, I didn't even consider that as an option.
Welcome to another episode of Dental Rift. I'm your co-host, Gary Bird. I'm the CEO of SMC National. We provide predictable new patient flow for offices just like yours.
My name is Tanner Applegate. I'm also the co-host, CEO, and founder of Unified Dental. We are a SaaS product that helps take this world of too many softwares and makes it super simple for your office.
So we don't normally have guests on this show, Dental Rift, but I had such a good interview with Ron from another podcast that I do, and you can go check that out, Dental Marketing Theory. And it was very polarizing. A lot of people liked it. Some people didn't like it. And we love those kinds of conversations here on Dental Rift. So I asked Ron, why don't you come on today? Ron is the CEO of The Dentist Agent. And Ron, I really want to just jump into this topic. You were going 100 miles an hour right before we hit record around this thing in the dental industry that we're seeing where culture is really starting to impact some of these larger groups because people are being brought in that don't really understand dental, and they're being told to increase EBITDA, and some of the levers that they're pulling might not be the right ones for long-term growth. I would love to get your thoughts on that and then kind of take the conversation from there.
Sure. I'll give you an example. The last DSO I worked for, they brought in a CEO who had 5 years experience at the COO level at another DSO. And when he showed up, we had about 200 practices. When he showed up, his message was customer service first, internal and external. That's what his message was. Everybody reacted in an exceptionally positive way. They were willing to follow this guy. But eventually he made a couple of poor acquisitions and EBITDA suffered. So the equity firm that owned us got on his case about, hey, listen, you're down below 10%, blah, 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 blah. So then he started pulling some levers. That didn't work. So he eventually was let go. And then they brought in someone who was the former CEO of the restaurant Hooters, or CFO from Hooters. Didn't know anything about dental.
Of course.
And this guy, I mean, I swear to God, like he would show up in a dental practice and had no idea what was happening. But, even the office manager understood that they had more operational experience than this guy. And it was exceptionally challenging for this guy to get buy-in on any level. And we would sit in leadership meetings with this guy, and people with 20 years experience would tell him, no, that's not a good idea. You can't negotiate supplies like chicken wings, bro. It can't happen. And, he would lose his mind, and that person would get fired or that, and it was like nonstop. And then that guy lasted for like 6 months. And the people who suffered greatly though, were the people at the practice level, man, who had been, an office manager for 10 years and really cared about their patients and loved their doctor and wanted to do the right thing. And you got chicken wing guy over here telling you, okay, you need to pull this lever. We're going to pull back all the bonuses that we're giving people who are working hard, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, when you bring somebody in with no dental experience and expect them to improve EBITDA and get buy-in within the first 2 years, it's a very challenging thing to do. It's a very challenging, especially when you have an enormous ego that isn't going to take feedback from people who know dental, right? Like it's just a recipe for disaster.
I'm curious, Ron, then is your kind of blanket statement, don't ever hire a high-level executive that doesn't have dental experience? Or are you of the type where it depends on the person and here are the stipulations that I would look for in hiring a non-dentist to run a DSO?
It depends on the person.
Experience.
I feel like if you come in and just check your ego at the door, right? I don't care what you've done in the past. I don't care. Okay, yeah, maybe you sold a $40 million company. Maybe you made some great money in the past. At the end of the day, if you don't know dental, you really have to start at like the treatment coordinator level and work your way up and spend time in the practices. That's the other thing. Like when I gave you that example of those two guys that were brought in, the first guy that had dental experience went to every region. He was in every practice. He was talking to them about how he understood dental. He got the buy-in. The Hooters guy didn't go to one practice. He wasn't in the field. He wasn't talking to anybody. So if you're going to hire somebody outside of dental check their ego at the door, and let them go into the field and meet the people that are actually working day to day, right? Like that are doing the patient interactions.
Hey, sorry to disrupt the show, but I just have a quick commercial for you. We are going to be hosting 4 events over the next 12 months, and we're doing a little bit of everything for everybody. We have something around Full Arch. We have something for those that manage marketing. We have something for those that want to scale their practice at Dykema. And then also we have something next year that's for everybody in your practice to learn business skills and to really maximize the opportunities for you to grow your offices. You're not going to want to miss these. Visit smcnational.com/events. These are going to be the premier events that you're going to want to go to make sure that you're getting the tactical skills that you need to continue to grow the way that you want, because at SMC, we're all about growing. Yeah, I got a question around that, Ron. So if right now it's a tough market, so it's a tough market to hire, there's not a lot of people to hire. So some people are going to have to go outside of dental. Which industries are you seeing translate best over to dental at any level, whether it's leadership or at any level?
Well, optical translates like almost identical, right? It is very similar. Other than optical, though, I would say retail. You know, at the end of the day, if you're building a DSO, you're going to have extended hours, right? Access to care is a big part of your foundation. In retail, customer service level and extended hours are 2 big things in retail. So, you know, I would, for retail, optical, maybe veterinary, same thing. Because veterinary DSOs are the groups are very similar to DSOs, how they're built and structured.
Curious, Ron, I'm thinking through your chicken wing analogy guy with what other ones are doing, right? You're sitting here naming off a lot of these other industries, and I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what is the connection between the two? Chicken wing guy, right? He is still a service-based industry. Dental is basically, it is service, right? It's not about the crown that goes in the person's mouth. It's about the dentist that's doing the crown, right? And so in the Hooters industry, or right, your chicken wing guy, the person that he had was a replaceable, non-licensed individual that was the server, right? If I get you bad chicken wings, the server is the one that's actually providing the service. You can hire and fire a Hooters server all day long. But if you do that with a licensed professional like a dentist, where you treat them like a Hooters server, where you can hire and fire them just based off of certain physical qualities, then there's no way that you're going to be successful in the dental industry, right? So it's really, I guess, then the biggest key factor to recognize as you're coming into a DSO is that, hey, you've got this licensed individual that is not as interchangeable as a lot of other service-based industries are. So you've got to protect not only that ego, but also that person's relationship with that practice, right? You've got to keep them in to a degree, and it's not as easy as, I'm going to go and negotiate all of my gauzes down to the cheapest price because that's going to piss off your doctor.
Well, I actually have a couple of thoughts on that, but I completely agree. And I would add hygienists in there too, Tanner, to be honest with you, especially in today's environment.
Especially right now.
Hygienists are exceptionally challenging to find. Good ones are even more rare. But I would say, you know, when you walk into a dental practice and you're talking about supply costs, and stuff that the doctor really, like, you know, if you're going to nickel and dime a doctor and a hygienist, it doesn't work at the end of the day. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like you're focused on the wrong things. Increasing top line, right? Like patient flow, number one. Yes. Marketing, yes. Right? New patient flow is the lifeblood of every freaking practice. I don't care if you're spending a boatload of money on labs. If the doctor's focused on the fact that this is a high quality lab, and I want to use this lab, let the doctor use that lab. But my other thing is there's a very thin line between, you know, hugging your doctors and finding this doctor that does $100,000 a month in production and maybe his quality sucks. What I've seen at the DSO space is that guy that's doing $100,000 in production, but the quality, everybody's kind of aware that he might be a hack. That guy gets to live. There's nobody talking to that guy about improving his quality because he's bringing in the money. Do you know what I mean? And if it was equivalent to another doctor who was maybe at 40, 50 grand a month, that guy will be gone. But the 100 grand guy gets to stay even though he's a hack.
And what happens around the 100 grand guy, though, is that you start seeing the individuals around him starting to turn over, right? It's the assistant that's getting yelled at because they just had to reseat the same crown 5 times that gets
put up with it, that they leave.
Yeah, I don't know about. I'd say that the flip side of that though is that $100,000 guy creates a very loyal team around him because he throws them money. He'll throw them extra bonuses
If he's in charge of that. Yes, I agree.
Wow.
If he's an associate though, then usually they can't pay him enough because he's not in charge of it.
Well, that's true. But I think on the side, though, I've had a bunch of doctors on the side just throw their assistants money.
Interesting.
And everybody becomes very loyal, right? So then if he creates this bubble account.
Yeah,
let's want to know about.
Yeah, dive into this.
Because I ran a DSO for many years, Ron. And so I've gone through the $100,000 doctor that is sitting there off every patient, makes a ton of money, but we're like, we can't let him go. Like, he's making us a lot of money, but he's also not a culture fit too. Right. And he's got a whole sub cost to him of like, hey, all these remakes and such. But so you're saying though, that there's a high likelihood that the reason why that employee that complained about him all the time, the reason why she stood there, which I always asked myself, why do you stay even though you hate this dentist, is because he's doing a little bit of money under the table.
Yes, of course.
Interesting.
Hey,
I mean, I didn't even consider that as an option, but I think that, it makes sense. So I'm curious, like, are you seeing that happen a lot?
First of all, there aren't a lot of $100,000 guys walking around, right? Especially in the DSO space that's built in a traditional private practice model. There are a bunch of them in like the Aspens and the Pacifics, but if you take those out of the mix, like Smile Brands, where it looks like a private practice, that's their model. There aren't a lot of $100,000 general dentists roaming around that world. So because there are so few of them, I would say probably 50% of them are throwing their team money. That's my guess. And this is all based on my experience. From my experience with Gary's last podcast, I need to make everybody aware. I'm not making these blanket statements. I'm just talking about my experience with candidates and my own experience at the DSO space. That's all, man.
Where I see the most $100,000 dentists walking around in the DSO world is the doctor that sells his practice because he wants to get an EBITDA arbitrage, but has to stay on in order to get that EBITDA arbitrage. That's where those $100,000 dentists are staying, because they're the sharks that own their own office that want the increase from the sellout.
Well, what I've seen recently is I have a couple of clients that are, those 40, 50 practice groups that are acquiring practices, and they get that owner on board that was doing $3 million a year by himself, and all of a sudden his production tanks. He just got the payout and he doesn't care anymore, right? Like, the team, they pride themselves on being very hands off, right? They're a hands off DSO. We let you do what you got to do. But then the guy starts tanking in production, and they don't know how to manage it, right? What are you going to do? You got a 3-year contract with this guy now. You just bought his practice, and he's not showing up on Fridays anymore, right? Like,
you got to get all those pieces buttoned up at the beginning. No, it's true. And the hands off ones that I see do it really well are, you keep a little bit of equity that you cash out at this extra arbitrage. But in order to do that, you have to commit to maintain this level of EBITDA that your practice had before. Right. And so, the ones that buy them out completely, you're screwed.
Well, it speaks to like the inexperience at the DSO. Like, everybody hopped on the DSO train, and like we could start our own DSO. Right. And it speaks to the inexperienced folks that will buy this guy's practice, give him a boatload of money, and then expect him to keep producing. Right. Like, without
you only make that mistake once, though, luckily.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So Ron, tell us about the model. So a lot of our audience that are going to be listening to this are in the dental industry. A lot of people who have DSOs, budding DSOs, I should say, like 5 practices, maybe 10 practices. What would you say to them that are dealing with all of these things on the front line? They are starting to make more acquisitions. They are considering de novos, but obviously recruiting is a big part of that. What would be your advice based on what you're seeing in the market right now?
Well, from a recruiting perspective, the most important thing is networking, man. I cannot stress this enough. You got people in your practice that have been through classes with other licensed providers on some level. They're probably in groups with other licensed providers on some level. The school that they went to, they could be active there. I would really focus on initially networking that way. My tip is for hygiene. Hygiene has been a big pain point over the last 2 years for everybody. I would say equivalent to doctor, right? It's almost equivalent. All the hygiene schools, the local hygiene schools, especially if they're private, they have a board. You could put your office manager, the board meets once a quarter. And if you're on that board, you get first dibs on the graduating class. and it costs nothing. And it's like an hour every quarter. You go and you sit on the board and they talk about, hey, how can we provide better care? Or how can we, put out better hygienists or whatever? You can get on that board. I would also recommend for assistants, you can do the same thing, especially for private assistant schools. And I would also network, study groups for doctors, alumni groups for doctors. They're all over the country. Seattle Study Club is everywhere. And especially if you have a clinical aspect that you're bringing to the table, they're open to listening to you. So you can you can say, hey, this is what we're doing in our practice, but hey, by the way, we also need a doctor, or we also need a hygienist, or whatever. There's a lot of ways. I would focus on networking first because it's an in-house. You already know everybody, right? You already have some connections you may not be aware of. The second thing is you got to assign someone at the practice level who's focused on recruiting for at least a few hours during the week, and you have to give them those few hours. You can't just add that onto the plate of somebody who's also doing treatment coordinating and confirming appointments and collecting the money and kissing the doctor's ass. You know what I mean? Like all of that stuff is challenging, right? So I would dedicate at least, it depends on what your needs are at the practice level, but I would find somebody to dedicate, 5-10 hours a week, maybe 5 for sourcing
5 to
candidates.
10 hours. Man, Ron. So I'm sitting here thinking back on my experience and I'm like, so you're telling me I got to take my 20% overhead right now that exists in the in-practice level. They're already complaining to me all the time that they're not getting done all the crap. I got RCM stuff I need them to do. I've got all these insurance, scheduling, blah, blah, blah. And now you're telling me I need to throw on some HR time in there too. Take someone that's obviously represents the culture of the company well enough, is smart enough to learn HR and recruiting. And I need to take this unicorn of an individual and give them 5 to 10 hours now to do recruiting, right? Like,
or find somebody in a group of practices and give them an elevated title, and then add a couple of things underneath their bucket and pay them a little more, right? Like there's ways to figure that out, right?
Got it. So I was curious if you felt like the individual in the practice was important versus the individual that represents the group, right? The person that represents the group doesn't know the dynamic of each office that they may or may not be recruiting for, but they at least represent the culture that the group wants to.
Tanner, that's an interesting thought. Like after the podcast with Gary, I got into it with one of an executive at a DSO, really into it because I have a 24 question questionnaire I send to all of my clients, and it outlines every detail of their practice. I know what a day in the life of a doctor's like there. And I have about 50 open jobs, and I'm doing it myself right now. I have another recruiter, but at the end of the day, if you're recruiting for a practice, you should know what's happening in practice. You should know those details. And I think that the biggest challenge there with the larger DSOs is that the recruiters don't. When a recruiter reaches out to a doctor, they barely can speak the dental speak, right? Let alone know what's happening at the individual practice on a day-to-day basis, right? The individual practice may have an amazing assistant that's been there for 10 years. Recruiter doesn't know that. Well, you need to know that to close the deal, to get a doctor interested, right? Now, the executive at the DSO I was arguing with was like, well, I got over 50 recruiters. How am I going to train everyone? No. He lost his mind on me about overhead and time and training and everything else. But I said, listen, the investment at the end of the day is worth it, right? Like, it will take you less time to find a more qualified doctor and get them signed up if your recruiter knows what's going on day to day at the practice level they're recruiting for.
Otherwise, you're going to experience turnover anyways, because they're not going to be happy, even though they just threw somebody in there.
Right. Well, on the flip side of that, too, you could say, hey, listen, we've gone through 3 assistants and 4 managers in this practice. It's a do-over, doc. But let me tell you the upside, right? Like, you could be honest that way, too. Doctors understand that this is a business. They've been through this, most of them, except for the new grads. They have no idea. But most of them understand, there's challenges here.
I like that you lead with the fact that you have predefined questions, right? How many times does a recruiter and or anyone in charge of HR go up and say, hey, you're wanting me to hire a new doctor. What do you want out of them? Right? Well, I want them to do this and I want them to do that. And you're like, okay, yeah, like you want the Goldilocks child that doesn't exist. Okay. And so the problem is like also now we're out there trying to find these people. And the reality is like that they wouldn't actually fit in their company culture, even if they did exist.
Right.
Right. So I love the fact that you lead with questions to know, okay, based off of your answers here, here's the type of person that will work and won't work. So how do you train that office manager that got elevated to an HR title across all the locations? How do you I mean, do they just need to learn trial by fire?
That's a good question. I think, well, first of all, from a recruiting perspective, sourcing is the most important thing. It's 80% of the job, finding the candidates, right? So I would initially start there. And then listen, here's how I'm training my recruiter now, to be honest with you. She doesn't come from dental. She's a sales girl who's got like a golf background.
Nice.
And I'm training her on sourcing first for the first like 60 days. You do role playing, and role playing is a big thing in the dental practice anyways, right? Especially from a treatment court. So you do role playing, and you let them listen in on your phone calls at the end of the day, right? Those three things should be the foundation of what you do. And then you should help them come up with the questions though. Like you elevate this HR person, you say, okay, go find me. I need some assistance. I need a hygienist and da. But you should also help them understand what they should be, once you define those questions, work with them to define those questions, Tanner. Do you know what I'm saying? Like the ones that I have, I know 99% of the candidates that I talk to, because I do doctors primarily and executives, they're going to ask me these questions. I'm going to know the answers. I'm going to know, how many hygienists there are, what the new patient flow is, what the collection rate is, what the COP program is, all that stuff. There is some training. I know you're looking at it from an ownership perspective. There is some training involved, man. I hate to break it to you. You're going to spend some money. This is an investment, man. I don't know what to tell you, bro.
Where do you send them, though?
Yeah. So do you have anybody, can you point to anybody in the industry that's doing this well, that has this kind of recruiting figured out? And can you point to people who maybe don't have it figured out from a model standpoint, that to kind of avoid that approach?
I'm sure there's so many examples in both, but
I don't know who's doing well. In my mind, I'm not even doing it that well. I can improve. Do you know what I mean? Like I feel like the larger DSOs are much more of a volume-based game. I don't even know if they have the time. Like I spend an hour on the phone with every candidate I talk to, man. I walk them through, okay, these are the procedures you love. These are the ones you're going to refer out. These are your career goals. Now let's talk about what to look for in a practice that will fit that. And that's how I discuss it with candidates. Now that's a combination of my 15 years in the business. Most of the recruiters at the DSO space aren't having that conversation. They're giving the spiel about their model, whatever their model is. They're giving the spiel about what the benefits of that model are going to be and what the career path looks like for a doctor. And then they're scheduling them at the practice level, right? That's pretty much the mode. And they're doing that over and over again because they have a significant high volume of open jobs. So I'm not quite sure. I'm not aware of anybody in the industry that is really killing it in that regard. Tanner, are you? Like, I don't know.
And if they are, it's not one of those things that they're out there publicly talking about because they don't want it to be replicated, right? It's one of their key secrets. Recruiting right now is such a hot topic because that's one of the most competitive natures between DSOs. It's not competition for patients; it's competition for providers.
Yeah. There's
an abundance. And that executive that I was speaking to the other day, he was like, "I'm sick of these new grads. They're playing everybody against each other. They're telling me they really want my job. I send them a contract, and then all of a sudden they got 4 other contracts, and they're sending me the other 3 saying, "Can you match this offer?" Right?
Listen to the podcasts. All of the new grad podcasts. That's exactly what they're teaching them to do. And that's what everyone's listening to throughout school is all these podcasts about what do I do whenever I get my job or start my first practice or whatever. Yeah, that's where you should as a recruiter be listening is what are all these new grads listening to, because that's the exact advice they're giving them.
Well, it's interesting. I tell new grads, your job as a candidate is to get every offer you interview for, right? Like that's your job. Now, you don't have to tell them you want it. I think that the difference is this executive is pissed off because they're telling him, I want your job. I'm going to come work for you. And then once they get the contract, they take a step back and say, okay, well, this guy just gave me 50 grand sign on. You going to match this? What you got going on? And then you're like, hey, I thought you said you wanted this job because of X, Y, Z. And you're like, well, I guess, but money's over here. Right. Like, so I do think there has to be that fair play line in my mind too. Like, at the end of the day, you want to get the offer, but I think you have to be upfront and be like, I'm considering other opportunities, right? And from a candidate's perspective, I think that just is more professional.
Dirty. I mean, I can't say that I disagree with it, but I also think that we're just dealing with a different class of kids these days.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through like how would you tackle it if you were a new grad, Tanner or Ron, if you were a brand new grad?
To me, like TikTok to me is all about transparency that didn't exist before, right? Like you would never go on Facebook or Instagram and talk about my career path of how I'm making what I'm making. You go and jump on TikTok, you got all of these different career paths. They're like, I started out of this, and then I went to this, and then I went to this, right? They're way more transparent about things like pay now than they were ever in the past, right? And so I think that fighting against that is actually problematic, right? It is actually embracing that and being willing to lead that charge in an existing industry where they didn't. I think that's where you're going to end up better off.
Right. And the last podcast I was on, Gary, I was all about transparency, right? And from a recruiting perspective, transparency is the most important thing. It will set you above everybody else. You could sit. So I'll give you another example. And this states to the generational gap, Tanner, to be honest with you. I had a client I spoke to on Friday, completely fee for service practice, 2.8 million last year by himself. He had an associate, come in and work maybe. Oh, so it wasn't by himself. He had another associate with him. Associate's been out of school for a year. He's got a tiered structure for ownership and equity down the road. Like if you sign a 5-year contract, you'll get a third ownership at the end of the I think it was 3-year contract. You'll get a third ownership at the end of 3 years. And the associate was producing maybe $60K a month, give or take. The associate puts in his notice and the owner says, what's going on? Now, this is a completely fee for service, no payers, right? They're dictating their own fees. They're open Monday through Friday, no weekends, great life, significant patient base in a more rural area in the state of Michigan. The associate says, you know what? You need to give me 50% of everything. I'm making you way too much money and da. And this is a practice this owner has built for the last 28 years, right? And he just went total cash last 5 years. And he brought this associate in last year. The associate's like, you know what? I think I can do this on my own. So he leaves and he's going to go open up a completely PPO practice. Now, my take on the generation nowadays is like there are a big subset of dental school graduates who went from high school to undergrad to dental school without ever working one job in their entire life. And they come out and emotionally they're 18 years old. I mean, seriously, on every level. So you have to, from a recruiting perspective, you have to know what you're getting there, right? Now, I think this associate is like, in my mind, the gold standard in dental practices is a completely fee-for-service practice. If you're an owner, that's the best way to go about it, right? You can dictate your own fees. You're not beholden to anybody, and you usually have a much more loyal patient base. And the other cool thing is, if you do bring on an associate, you can pay them gross production, which all doctors, that's the golden egg for gross production, right? You don't have to worry about collections at the end of the day. So this owner was just flabbergasted that this associate decided that they could go, after a year of working and knows nothing really about nothing, can go buy their own practice and start a PPO plan world and thinks he's going to make the same amount of money that he was making at this guy's practice.
And he'll only learn that through the hard knocks, man.
Yeah, that's
Arrogance
there's so many.
youth.
There's so many layers in that, right? How long do you think it's going to take him? So let's say he goes out and he does start his own practice. He gets a loan. From the day that he quits to getting the loan, how long is it going to take until he's making as much money that he was making at the fee-for-service location?
On what he's acquiring, right? Like, is he going to, what kind of practice are you acquiring? What's the active patient base look like? How long has that provider been there? Does that provider have a loyal patient base? What the fees are, right? What the fee structure is. Now, all of a sudden, you're going from a completely cash-based where your fees are probably a little higher to a PPO world where your fees are going to be lower. So I would assume his ability to produce is going to go down a little bit before it goes up, because he's going to have to see more patients to make the same amount of money he was making.
Not just that, but he has to pay a big loan. He has a big loan now that he has to pay on top of his school bill.
On top of his school loans. Yeah.
So it's going to be it's going to be what, a decade, 5 years before he gets to where he was at the other place? Do you think it'll take that long?
It depends. I don't know who this guy is, right? He could be a hustler, man. He could be right out of New York City. He could be doing what he's got to do. I have no idea, but I would assume you're right. At least 5 years, Gary, at least.
Got it.
And I think that, his head will explode. I think there's a lot of things that he was sheltered as an associate running the business side that he didn't have to deal with. And now all of a sudden he's going to have to deal with, and dentists aren't prepared for that crap usually. A lot of it.
They don't teach you it in school. I mean, you have no idea unless you go and talk to another dentist that owns a practice and they're very transparent with you. which most of the time they're not. As we talked about earlier, a lot of times in the dental industry, there isn't transparency. There isn't transparency around any of this stuff. So then you have to kind of struggle through and learn it, as Tanner said, the school of hard knocks.
Right.
Yeah, I think that if you've got the entrepreneurial mentality that's wanting to do that, there's also, it's always not about the money too. A lot of the times it's also about the lifestyle satisfaction, right? I mean, you could look at it and say I was a complete idiot for leaving my DSO where we were established, we were growing, we were doing really well, to go in and gamble it all away in a software company where the likelihood of success is extremely low, right? Like, do you know how long it's going to take me to get back to where I was with that DSO? Well, the reality is like, sometimes it's not always about the money. It's also about the fact that like, I want to try to see if I can do this, right? And so if you don't give me 50%, to me, it's worth at least trying on my own versus giving up and saying I'm stuck at this for the rest of my life.
That's a good point. A year out of dental school, though, I feel like that guy's gonna, it's gonna be Sisyphus for a little while.
One of my good friends went and bought 3 offices right out of school, even though he had gotten offers in school to come and be these amazing associates at all these other DSOs. But he's like, no, like I have that drive where I want to do it. That right after school, everyone was like, you're going to fail. Go work somewhere else for a year, 3 years, etc. And he's like, no. And so he went out and he had 3 offices under LOI waiting for his license to come through so he could close on them.
Nice.
Right? And yeah, it sucked. He failed for a handful of months and then figured it all out. Now they're at 20. He's like, what, 5 years in, and they're at 25 locations or so.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So he figured it out.
It happens.
That's awesome.
I mean, there's people out there.
I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm saying I think that they're not aware of what the misery is that they're going to like. They're just not. You know what I mean? Like. And some people can handle that. It depends. Like I think this associate has a significantly large ego, and it's not really attached to reality on some level.
Good.
Right?
That's all you need is a large ego.
Ron, any last words for us and for the audience? I think you've provided a lot of value today and a lot of different perspectives. Anything else that you would like to close us out on? Last thoughts?
I think if you're running a DSO, especially if you're an emerging DSO that's growing, please take care of your people at the practice level. And don't make decisions in a vacuum. Listen to multiple opinions before you make a decision. You may have a regional manager come in and tell you, something's going on at this practice, but that regional manager just hates that manager for some reason because they have blue eyes or whatever. You need to figure it out. You need to be aware of what's happening and protect your people at the practice level. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Transparency is the best thing to do. Transparency is the most important thing in recruiting and retaining your people, and, pay them a fair wage, right? Like,
Yeah. Last, how can people reach out to you if someone wants to connect to you and maybe use your services to get some help or just get a better understanding of what you do? How can they get in front of you?
Sure. You can email me at ron@thedentistagent.com. You can call me at 315-447-7491 or text me at that number. Yeah, those are the best ways to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Appreciate it, man.
It's been a really good episode. We'll do this again soon, I promise.
Thanks, guys. That was great talking with you. Take care.